The ice-cold waters of the Delaware River reflected the pale moonlight. As General George Washington stood at the bow of the lead boat, his weathered face etched with determination and desperation. It was the night of December 25th, 1776, and the Continental Army was about to embark on what many would later call the most audacious military maneuver of the Revolutionary War. Behind him, nearly 2,400 men huddled in their makeshift boats, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they prepared to cross into enemy territory. The situation had become dire beyond imagination. Just months earlier, the Continental Army had suffered crushing defeats in New York, forcing Washington's forces into a humiliating retreat across New Jersey. Morale had plummeted to unprecedented lows, and desertions were occurring daily as soldiers abandoned what seemed like a hopeless cause. The British forces, under the command of General William Howe, had established winter quarters throughout New Jersey, confident that the rebellion would collapse before spring arrived. Washington knew that without a decisive victory, the Continental Army would dissolve entirely when enlistments expired on December 31st. The cause of American independence hung by the thinnest of threads, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The general had devised a bold plan that would either revitalize the revolution or destroy what remained of his army in a final, catastrophic gamble. The crossing itself proved to be a nightmare of epic proportions. Chunks of ice, some as large as wagon wheels, crashed against the boats as the men struggled against the powerful current. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and many soldiers lacked proper boots, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Marines, experienced fishermen from Massachusetts, worked tirelessly to navigate the treacherous waters, their expertise proving invaluable in a life-or-death crossing as dawn approached on December 26th. Washington's forces finally assembled on the Pennsylvania side of the river. Though not without significant delays, the original plan had called for 3 separate crossings, but ice and weather had prevented the other 2 divisions from making the journey. Washington now faced the terrible reality that his force would be operating alone, without the reinforcements he had counted on for the assault on Trenton. The march to Trenton began in earnest as the first light of dawn broke through the winter clouds. The men moved into columns along snow-covered roads, their feet numb with cold and their muskets growing heavy in their frozen hands. Many soldiers wrapped rags around their feet in a futile attempt to ward off frostbite, while others left trails of blood in the snow from their torn and battered boots. According to historical accounts from the Smithsonian Institute, the conditions during this march were so severe that 2 soldiers actually froze to death during the 9-mile journey to Trenton. Washington rode alongside his men, offering words of encouragement and sharing in their suffering. He understood that this moment would define not only his leadership, but the very future of the American cause. The element of surprise was crucial. If the Hessian garrison at Trenton received warning of the approaching Continental forces, the entire operation would end in disaster. As the army approached the outskirts of Trenton, Washington could see smoke rising from the chimneys of the town's buildings. Inside those structures, nearly 1,500 Hessian soldiers under Colonel Johann Rall were likely still recovering from their Christmas celebrations, unaware that an army of desperate patriots was about to descend upon them with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The attack on Trenton began at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning on December 26, 1776, with a ferocity that caught the Hessian defenders completely off guard. Washington had divided his forces into 2 main assault columns, one under the command of General Nathanael Greene attacking from the north, and another led by General John Sullivan, striking from the west. The coordination was flawless, a testament to Washington's tactical brilliance and his officers' unwavering dedication to the cause. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery of artillery, positioned at the head of King Street, began a thunderous barrage that echoed through the narrow streets of Trenton. The cannon fire was devastating in its accuracy and psychological impact, sending Hessian soldiers scrambling from their quarters in various states of undress and confusion. The sound of American voices shouting victory or death, Washington's chosen password for the operation, filled the air as Continental soldiers poured into the town from multiple directions. Colonel Johann Rall, the Hessian commander, had been warned repeatedly about the possibility of an American attack, but his arrogance and dismissive attitude toward the Continental Army had led him to ignore these warnings. When the attack began, Rawl was reportedly still suffering from the effects of the previous night's Christmas festivities, and his delayed response to the crisis proved fatal to his command, and ultimately to himself. The battle raged through the streets with an intensity that surprised even the most experienced soldiers on both sides. American forces, energized by the success of their surprise attack, fought with a desperation born of their precarious situation. Private Joseph White of Massachusetts later wrote that he had never seen men fight with such determination, knowing that failure would mean not just military defeat, but the complete collapse of their dreams of independence. Within 45 minutes, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Hessians, professional soldiers though they were, found themselves trapped in an impossible tactical situation. American artillery controlled the main streets, while Continental infantry pressed in from multiple directions, making organized resistance virtually impossible. Colonel Rawl, attempting to rally his men for a counterattack, was mortally wounded by musket fire and died later that day. The victory at Trenton was complete and overwhelming. Washington's forces captured nearly 900 Hessian prisoners, along with their weapons, supplies, and artillery pieces. Perhaps more importantly, the Continental Army had achieved this stunning success while suffering only 5 casualties: 2 soldiers who froze to death during the march, and 3 wounded in the actual fighting, including future President James Monroe, then serving as a young lieutenant. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond the immediate military benefits. Word of the triumph spread rapidly throughout the colonies, rekindling hope in hearts that had grown cold with despair. Newspapers from Boston to Charleston trumpeted the news, and recruitment offices that had been empty for weeks suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers, eager to join Washington's reinvigorated army. However, Washington understood that one victory, however spectacular, would not be sufficient to sustain the revolution. The British would undoubtedly respond with overwhelming force, and the Continental Army remained vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The general faced a critical decision: retreat back across the Delaware River to the relative safety of Pennsylvania, or press forward and attempt to build upon this initial success. The decision was made more complicated by the approaching expiration of his soldiers' enlistments. On December 31st, many of the men who had crossed the Delaware River with such courage were preparing to return home, their term of service complete. Washington needed another victory, and he needed it quickly. Before his army dissolved around him, intelligence reports suggested that British forces under General Charles Cornwallis were already mobilizing to respond to the Trenton attack. Time was running short, and Washington knew that his next move would either consolidate the gains from Trenton or potentially undo all the good that had been accomplished in that frozen New Jersey town. The days following the victory at Trenton presented George Washington with perhaps the most complex strategic challenge of his military career. While the triumph had electrified the colonies and restored faith in the Continental cause, the harsh realities of 18th century warfare meant that the advantage gained could disappear as quickly as it had materialized. British General Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's most experienced and aggressive commanders, was already marching toward Trenton with a force of nearly 8,000 men, determined to crush Washington's army and restore British prestige. Washington faced an agonizing dilemma that would test every ounce of his strategic genius. His army, though buoyed by their recent success, remained pitifully small compared to the approaching British force. More critically, the enlistments of many of his most experienced soldiers were set to expire on December 31st, 1776. Without these men, the Continental Army would be reduced to little more than a militia force, incapable of standing against professional British and Hessian troops. The general made a decision that would become legendary in the annals of military history. On December 30th, he assembled his troops and made an impassioned plea for them to extend their service. Standing before men whose feet were wrapped in bloody rags and whose faces bore the marks of incredible hardship, Washington appealed not to their sense of duty alone, but to their understanding of what was at stake for future generations of Americans. "My brave fellows," Washington reportedly said, his voice carrying across the ranks, "you have done all I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold. Dear, you have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you." The emotional weight of his words, combined with the promise of a $10 bounty, convinced many soldiers to remain with the army for an additional 6 weeks. Meanwhile, intelligence reports brought disturbing news about Cornwallis's advance. The British general had left his winter quarters in New York with unprecedented speed, driven by anger over the humiliation at Trenton and determined to deliver a crushing blow to Washington's forces. His army included not only British regulars, but also Hessian reinforcements, eager to avenge their comrades' defeat. Washington's response to this threat demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would define his legacy as one of history's great military commanders. Rather than retreat across the Delaware River, as many of his officers advised, he chose to remain in New Jersey and prepare for what appeared to be an inevitable confrontation. However, his preparations were unlike anything his enemies expected. Historical records from the National Archives indicate that Washington's strategic thinking during this period was influenced by his study of classical military texts, particularly Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars. The general ordered his men to begin construction of defensive positions along the Sunpink Creek, just south of Trenton. These fortifications appeared to be the work of a commander preparing for a traditional defensive battle, but Washington had something far more ambitious in mind. While his soldiers worked on the visible defenses, the general was quietly developing a plan that would once again rely on audacity, timing, and the element of surprise. As December 31st arrived, bringing with it the sound of approaching British drums and the sight of enemy campfires dotting the New Jersey landscape, Washington's army took their positions behind their hastily constructed earthworks. The men, exhausted from days of marching and digging, nevertheless maintained their spirits. Buoyed by their commander's unwavering confidence and their own recent taste of victory, Cornwallis, upon reaching the area around Trenton, was pleased to see Washington's forces apparently trapped with their backs to the Delaware River. The British general was convinced that he had finally cornered the elusive American commander and could deliver the decisive blow that would end the rebellion once and for all. January 1st, 1777 dawned gray and cold as General Charles Cornwallis positioned his forces for what he believed would be the final confrontation with George Washington's Continental Army. The British commander, supremely confident in his superior numbers and the professional quality of his troops, had spent the previous evening studying maps and planning an assault that would drive the Americans into the Delaware River or force their complete surrender. The British advance began at first light, with columns of red-coated soldiers moving methodically toward the American positions. Along the Sunpink Creek, Cornwallis had deployed his forces in classic European fashion, with artillery support and cavalry units ready to exploit any breakthrough in the American defensive line. The sight of the approaching enemy forces, their bayonets gleaming in the pale winter sunlight, would have been intimidating to even the most seasoned veterans. Washington, however, had not positioned his army along the creek merely to fight a defensive battle. Throughout the night of December 31st, he had been implementing a deception that would rank among the most audacious military ruses in history. While maintaining the appearance of a force preparing for a desperate last stand, he had actually been setting the stage for an escape that would confound his enemies and set up an even more daring offensive operation. The first attacks came around 10 o'clock in the morning as British advance units probed the American positions for weaknesses. The Continental soldiers, many of whom were veterans of the Trenton fighting, held their ground with remarkable determination. Artillery exchanges erupted along the creek, with cannon fire echoing across the frozen New Jersey landscape. To Cornwallis and his officers, observing from the command position, the Americans appeared to be fighting exactly as expected, desperately but futilely. As the day progressed, the British attacks intensified. Wave after wave of disciplined infantry assaults crashed against the American defensive positions, only to be repelled by determined resistance and effective use of artillery. Captain Alexander Hamilton's guns, which had proven so decisive at Trenton, once again played a crucial role in holding the British at bay. The young artillery officer, who would later become one of America's founding fathers, demonstrated tactical skills that belied his 21 years of age. By late afternoon, Cornwallis was growing frustrated with his inability to break through the American lines. His forces had suffered heavier casualties than expected, and the Americans showed no signs of the collapse he had anticipated. However, the British general remained confident that time was on his side. With the Delaware River at their backs and no apparent avenue of retreat, Washington's forces would have no choice but to surrender when their ammunition ran low, or accept annihilation in a final British assault. Will bag the fox in the morning. Cornwallis reportedly told his officers as evening approached, using a hunting metaphor that reflected his certainty about the following day's outcome. The British commander ordered his troops to establish strong positions for the night, intending to launch a massive dawn assault that would end American resistance once and for all. What Cornwallis did not know was that Washington had spent months studying his opponent's character and tactical preferences. The American general understood that the British commander's conventional military training, while effective in traditional European warfare, could become a liability when facing an unconventional opponent willing to break the accepted rules of 18th century combat. As darkness fell on January 1st, Washington put into motion the most critical phase of his plan. While maintaining the appearance of an army preparing for a morning battle, he began moving his forces in a maneuver so bold and risky that many of his own officers initially questioned its feasibility. The fate of the American Revolution would depend on whether Washington could execute his plan without detection, and whether his exhausted soldiers could enjoy yet another night march through the frozen New Jersey wilderness. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate once again that in warfare, as in politics, the most audacious plans often yield the most spectacular results. Washington was about to prove that a cornered fox might have more tricks than his pursuers imagined. As the sun set on January 1st, 1777, George Washington initiated one of the most brilliant tactical deceptions in military history, while British General Charles Cornwallis slept confidently in his headquarters, secure in the belief that the American army was trapped and would be easily defeated at dawn. Washington was orchestrating an escape that would leave his enemies bewildered and off balance for days to come. The plan required extraordinary coordination and absolute silence from nearly 5,000 men. Washington had ordered his troops to wrap their wagon wheels in cloth and muffle their horses' hooves to prevent any sound that might alert British sentries to their movement. The army would have to march in complete darkness along unfamiliar roads, carrying all their artillery and supplies while maintaining perfect discipline throughout the night. The deception began with a series of carefully orchestrated ruses designed to convince the British that the Continental Army remained in position along the Sunpink Creek. Small groups of soldiers were left behind to maintain campfires and create the sounds of normal camp activity. These brave volunteers, risking capture or death, would keep up the pretense until the last possible moment. Before slipping away to rejoin the main force, Colonel Joseph Reed, one of Washington's most trusted aides, had spent days gathering intelligence about British dispositions throughout central New Jersey. His reports indicated that while Cornwallis had concentrated his forces around Trenton, other British positions remained lightly defended. Most significantly, the garrison at Princeton, located just 12 miles northeast of Trenton, consisted of only about 1,200 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood. Washington's audacious plan called for his army to march northeast through the darkness, bypassing Cornwallis entirely and striking at Princeton before the British could respond. The maneuver would not only remove his forces from immediate danger, but also position them to inflict another damaging blow against British prestige and morale. If successful, the plan would demonstrate that the Continental Army had evolved from a retreating rabble into a force capable of strategic initiative and tactical sophistication. The march began at midnight, with soldiers moving in single file along narrow country roads that were barely visible in the darkness. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and many men continued to leave bloody footprints in the snow from their inadequate footwear. Despite their suffering, the troops maintained remarkable discipline, understanding that their survival and the survival of the revolution depended on complete silence. According to military historians at West Point, Washington's night march to Princeton represents one of the finest examples of tactical mobility. In 18th century warfare, General Hugh Mercer, leading the advance guard, proved invaluable in navigating the treacherous terrain and maintaining the army's direction through the darkness. Mercer, a Scottish-born physician who had become one of Washington's most reliable subordinates, understood that the success of the entire operation depended on reaching Princeton before dawn broke and exposed the American movement to British observation. As the hours passed and the army continued its silent march, Washington rode among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement and ensuring that no unit fell behind. The general knew that his soldiers were pushing themselves beyond normal human endurance, marching and fighting almost continuously for nearly a week while living on minimal rations and sleeping in the open during one of the coldest winters in Recent memory died by 4 o'clock in the morning. Advanced scouts reported that they were approaching the outskirts of Princeton. The town appeared quiet, with no indication that the British garrison suspected an approaching American force. Washington allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The most difficult part of his plan had succeeded, and his army was now in position to strike another unexpected blow against British forces in New Jersey. However, the general also understood that the real test lay ahead. Cornwallis would soon discover that the American army had vanished from Assunpink Creek, and when that happened, the British commander would waste no time in pursuing Washington's forces. The Americans would have only a brief window of opportunity to attack Princeton, claim victory, and position themselves for whatever came next in this deadly game of military chess. The first rays of sunlight on January 3, 1777, illuminated a scene that would forever change the course of the American Revolution. Washington's Continental Army, having completed their incredible night march, now stood poised on the outskirts of Princeton, ready to deliver another stunning blow to British forces in New Jersey. The exhausted soldiers, their faces gaunt from hunger and their bodies numbed by cold, nevertheless maintained their discipline as they prepared for what many understood might be the decisive battle of their lives. The British garrison at Princeton, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, had received no warning of the approaching American force. Mawhood, a veteran officer with considerable experience in colonial warfare, had positioned his troops according to standard garrison procedures. With no expectation of an immediate attack, his forces consisted primarily of the 17th Foot Regiment, along with elements of the 40th Foot in a detachment of light dragoons, professional soldiers, who were among the finest in the British Army. Washington's battle plan demonstrated the tactical lessons he had learned from previous encounters with British forces. Rather than attempting a frontal assault against prepared positions, he divided his army into multiple columns that would converge on Princeton from different directions simultaneously. This approach would prevent the British from concentrating their defensive fire and would create confusion among the enemy ranks about the size and disposition of the attacking force. General Hugh Mercer's brigade, advancing along the Quaker Road, encountered the first British resistance around sunrise. Mawhood, having spotted American movement in the distance, had dispatched a reconnaissance force to investigate what he initially assumed was merely a small raiding party. The collision between these two forces occurred in a field near the Thomas Clark farm, setting off a fierce engagement that would determine the fate of the entire battle. The fighting began with devastating volleys of musket fire that echoed across the frozen landscape. Mercer's men, many of whom were veterans of earlier campaigns, initially held their ground against the British regulars, but the professional discipline and superior training of Mawhood's soldiers soon began to tell. When the British fixed bayonets and charged, the American line began to waver, and then broke under the relentless pressure of steel and disciplined violence. General Mercer himself fell during this initial engagement, mortally wounded by multiple bayonet thrusts as he attempted to rally his retreating men. The loss of their commander sent shockwaves through the American ranks, and for a terrifying moment, it appeared that the entire attack might collapse just as victory seemed within reach. British soldiers, sensing the shift in momentum, pressed their advantage with the ruthless efficiency that had made them feared throughout Europe. And America died at this critical juncture. Washington himself rode directly into the battle, his presence immediately recognizable to both American and British soldiers, mounted on his white horse and exposing himself to enemy fire. With apparent indifference to personal danger, the commander-in-chief rallied his wavering troops through the sheer force of his personal courage and leadership. Captain John Fleming of the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment later wrote that seeing Washington under fire inspired every man to fight like a lion. The arrival of American reinforcements, including units under the command of General John Cadwalader and Colonel Daniel Hitchcock, transformed the tactical situation in a matter of minutes. These fresh troops, advancing from multiple directions as Washington had planned, caught the British forces in an increasingly untenable position. Mawhood, recognizing that his small garrison could not withstand an attack by the entire Continental Army, made the difficult decision to conduct a fighting withdrawal toward Trenton. Historical accounts from Princeton University archives document that the battle lasted approximately 45 minutes, with the most intense fighting occurring in the area now occupied by the university campus. The British retreat quickly became a rout as American forces pressed their advantage. With growing confidence, Continental soldiers their spirits soaring with the realization that they were once again defeating professional British troops pursued the fleeing enemy through the streets of Princeton itself. The psychological impact of this reversal was enormous. Within the span of a week, Washington's army had transformed from a demoralized, retreating force into an aggressive, victorious army capable of outmaneuvering and defeating their supposedly superior opponents. The victory at Princeton on January 3, 1777, marked far more than just another tactical success for George Washington's Continental Army. As British soldiers fled northward toward New Brunswick and American forces secured control of the town, the reverberations of this triumph began to spread throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic Ocean, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the Revolutionary War. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the extent of American success. Washington's forces had captured significant quantities of military supplies, including artillery pieces, muskets, and precious ammunition that the Continental Army desperately needed. More importantly, they had inflicted substantial casualties on British forces while suffering relatively light losses themselves. The psychological impact of defeating professional British troops in open combat for the second time in just over a week proved to be incalculable. General Charles Cornwallis, awakening on January 2nd to discover that Washington's army had vanished from their positions along the Sunpink Creek, had immediately ordered a pursuit. However, by the time British forces reached Princeton, the Americans had already secured their victory and were preparing to move to more defensible positions. Cornwallis found himself in the humiliating position of pursuing an enemy who consistently remained one step ahead of his conventional military thinking. Washington, understanding that his army could not sustain prolonged combat against superior British numbers, made the strategic decision to withdraw to winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. This position, located in the hills of northern New Jersey, offered numerous tactical advantages, including difficult terrain that would hinder British movement, and multiple escape routes should retreat become necessary. The selection of Morristown demonstrated Washington's growing sophistication as a strategic commander. The impact of the Princeton victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Throughout the colonies, newspapers carried detailed accounts of Washington's brilliant maneuvers and the Continental Army's repeated successes against professional British forces. Recruitment offices that had been empty for months suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers eager to join what now appeared to be a winning cause. Contemporary accounts from the Pennsylvania Gazette and other colonial newspapers reveal that enlistments in the Continental Army increased by more than 300% in the weeks following the Battle of Princeton. In European capitals, the news from New Jersey forced a fundamental reassessment of the American conflict. British military leaders, who had confidently predicted that colonial resistance would collapse during the winter of 1776 to 1777, now faced the uncomfortable reality that they were dealing with an increasingly sophisticated enemy capable of strategic thinking and tactical innovation. The French government, which had been cautiously observing the American rebellion while considering whether to provide overt support, began to view the Continental Army as a potentially valuable ally against British power. The victories at Trenton and Princeton demonstrated that American forces could not only survive against professional European armies, but could defeat them through superior leadership and tactical flexibility. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Princeton established George Washington's reputation as one of the finest military commanders of his generation. His ability to transform a demoralized, retreating army into an aggressive, victorious force through a combination of personal courage, strategic vision, and tactical innovation proved that American leadership could match or exceed that of their European counterparts. The winter encampment at Morristown provided Washington with the time and space necessary to rebuild and retrain his army. The victories of the past week had brought precious months during which new recruits could be trained, supplies could be gathered, and alliances could be forged. The Continental Army that emerged from Morristown in the spring of 1777 would be fundamentally different from the desperate force that had crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night. The Battle of Princeton had achieved what Washington understood was essential for American success. It had transformed the Revolutionary War from a colonial rebellion that appeared doomed to failure into a legitimate war of independence with genuine prospects for victory. The momentum gained during those crucial 10 days in winter had shifted decisively toward the American cause. setting the stage for the international conflict that would ultimately secure American independence and establish the United States as a sovereign nation among the community of nations. In the broader context of world history, Princeton represented a turning point not just for America, but for the entire concept of democratic revolution. Washington's victories demonstrated that professional armies and established governments could be defeated by citizen soldiers fighting for principles they believed in passionately. This lesson would resonate throughout the world for generations to come, inspiring democratic movements and revolutionary causes across the globe.